Psalm 22 it is the Psalm of the Cross. We recognize in the very first verse of this psalm the familiar words of Christ on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" But before real circumstances, real trials that he's facing, Psalm is a lesson for us in how to apply gospel truth in our own lives. Notice David's approach to God in the tone of this psalm. Do we ever talk to God in this way? Do we ever wrestle with God as the psalmist seems to here? David, what he's going to do throughout this psalm is he's going to honestly express his doubts to God and bring his questions before God, and then will invoke God's promises in order to refute those doubts. We'll see this right away in verses 1 and 2. My God, why have you forsaken me?" Accompanying that doubting question, why have you forsaken me? David, in 3 times in 2 verses, claims, my God, oh my God. At a low point in his life, David's recalling God's promise in Exodus 6. I will take you to be my people, and I will be your God. Again, in verses 4 and 5, David continues this argument with himself by using history to comfort his soul. He says, "Our fathers trusted in you. They trusted, and you delivered them. They cried to you and were delivered. They trusted in you and were not ashamed." 4 times in 2 verses. Again, in verse 9, David uses this tactic. This time, he appeals to the fact that God has taken care of him from the womb. David recognizes that God was looking out for him and had a plan for him while he was in the womb and helpless to defend himself. Surely, God would not abandon him now among the trials and the enemies that he faced. But to understand the full meaning of this psalm, we must look beyond David to Christ. All throughout this psalm, there are allusions made to the cross. First, we already saw the very words of Christ in verse 1, but then if you look in verse 7 and 8, we can picture Christ on the cross as he's being mocked by those standing around him. All those who see me ridicule me. Verse 8, they say, "He trusted in the Lord, let him rescue him." In verse 15, we can see Christ hanging on the cross, begging for a drink when he says, "My tongue clings to my jaws. You have brought me to the dust of death." Verse 16, "They pierced my hands and feet." Again, in verse 18, "They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots." Throughout the first 21 verses of this psalm, there's a vivid image of suffering. But then there is a transition. In verse 22, it says, "I will declare your name to my brethren. In the midst of the assembly, I will praise you." The magnitude of this verse is revealed to us in Hebrews 2:12, where the author of Hebrews quotes from this very verse to make his point, and it is this. The author of Hebrews says, "It was fitting for the author of our salvation to be perfected through sufferings. For both he who sanctifies, Christ, and those who are sanctified are all from one Father. For which reason he's not ashamed to call them brethren, saying," and he quotes the verse, "I will proclaim your name to my brethren. In the midst of the congregation I will sing your praise." What a thought. The suffering servant on the cross is not ashamed to call us his brothers. But the good news doesn't stop there. As Jesus tells his apostles in Acts 1:8, "You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all of Judea and Samaria and to the end of the earth." In the same way, there's a crescendo that's building throughout the remainder of this psalm. In verse 23, it's the offspring of Israel that's called on to glorify the Lord. By verse 27, the gospel's gone out to all the ends of the earth. It says all the ends of the earth shall remember to turn to the Lord. And then by verse 30, the gospel is still going out, and it's being told and shared generationally as parents teach their children and pass it on. It shall be told to the coming generation, people yet unborn. And what is it that they're telling them? According to verse 31, it is that he has done it, that it is finished. Not only has God rescued and preserved his servant David in his crisis, but also David's son, whose victory is complete by raising him from the dead.